Florence has never been an easy city. Beneath the balanced beauty of its Pietraforte stone facades and the harmonious rhythm of its Renaissance squares, there has always existed an invisible pressure, as if every street carried the memory of centuries-long competition. Power in Florence never belonged to crowns or thrones. It belonged to families, to banks, to layers of stone stacked deliberately to tell the world who once stood behind them. Just behind the Palazzo Vecchio, along a narrow axis linking the political heart of the city with its network of powerful families, Palazzo Gondi appears quietly, without spectacle or display. It lacks the overwhelming grandeur of the Palazzo Pitti and does not project authority as openly as the palaces of the Medici. Instead, Palazzo Gondi exists like a whisper sustained over more than 5 centuries, a structure built not to impress the masses, but to reassure those within its walls that they had entered the ranks of Florence's enduring elite. Construction began in the late 15th century, at a particularly fragile moment in the city's history. Florence stood at the height of its wealth, yet remained dangerously exposed to continuous political instability. The Gondi family, emerging from the world of merchant banking, understood clearly that money alone was never enough. To endure in Florence, they needed stone architecture and a physical mark capable of surviving long after account books were forgotten. The choice of architect was no accident. Giuliano da San Gallo, one of the most respected architects of the Renaissance, brought to the project a language of restraint and control. The facade is not monumental in scale, yet its stonework is carefully graduated, shifting from rough-hewn blocks at street level to increasingly refined surfaces above, a visual metaphor for the Gondi family's ascent within Florentine society. Inside, the courtyard opens like a controlled breath. Light enters with intention, neither excessive nor wasted. This was a space designed for dialogue, for negotiation, for meetings whose outcomes could alter the fate of an entire lineage. Every column, every arch was placed not only to support the structure, but to reinforce an invisible social order in which the family remained at the center. For many decades, Palazzo Gondi stood as a symbol of measured success. The Gondi never surpassed the Medici in power, yet they existed alongside them, adapting, compromising, and occasionally stepping back to preserve their position. It was this caution that allowed the family to survive Florence's greatest upheavals, from internal conflicts and religious reforms to the constant reconfiguration of political authority. But Florence rarely allowed stability to last. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the balance of power began to shift. Banking families who once dominated the city faced a new reality. International trade routes were changing. Authority was consolidating under larger dynasties, and Florence was no longer Europe's indispensable financial center. Palazzo Gondi reflected this transformation in silence, not through visible cracks in its walls, but through the gradual absence of decisive moments within rooms once filled with influence. Grand halls that had hosted major negotiations slowly became spaces of ritual rather than engines of real power. The Gondi family remained, but Florence was beginning to move faster than they could follow. The decline of Florence's noble class did not unfold as an immediate tragedy. There was no single collapse, no definitive ending. Instead, it progressed quietly, generation by generation, as palaces like Palazzo Gondi continued to exist physically while steadily losing their central role in the city's political and economic life. The palace still stood. The stone retained its form. But its meaning began to change. Once a declaration of rising power, it became a witness to an older order of Florence in which authority had once been measured by the ability to build, maintain, and defend spaces like this. And it is here, within the stillness of these stone walls, that the longer story of this silent decline first begins to reveal itself. To understand why the decline of Florence's noble class unfolded so quietly, one must return to the true nature of power in the city itself. Florence was never built on military victory. It grew through credit, contracts, and the ability to move money faster than goods. For centuries, families like the Gondi survived not because they owned vast lands, but because they understood how to control the flow of European finance. But by the late 16th century, the economic map of the world began to change in ways Florence could not command. Atlantic trade routes opened, pulling financial gravity away from the Mediterranean. Antwerp, Amsterdam, and later London gradually replaced the role Florence had once held. Florentine banking families, accustomed to regional networks built on personal trust and family reputation, now faced financial systems that were larger, more impersonal, and far less forgiving. This shift did not arrive as a single collapse. It seeped into daily decisions. Loans became riskier. Long-standing relationships no longer guaranteed security. And most importantly, reputation, the invisible currency on which Florence's noble families had long relied, began to lose its value in a world increasingly driven by short-term profit. Within this changing landscape, palaces such as Palazzo Gondi became symbolic spaces rather than instruments of power. Reception halls, once used to finalize consequential agreements, were gradually repurposed for ceremony and social display. The family remained present in the life of the city, but its practical influence diminished, not through one defining defeat, but through countless small adjustments made in the name of survival. At the same time, Florence's political structure was transforming. Authority became increasingly concentrated in ruling dynasties, particularly the Medici, as the city shifted from a merchant republic toward a court-centered system of governance. For traditional noble families, this transition was deeply destabilizing. Power no longer rested in negotiation among equals, but in proximity to centralized authority. Palazzo Gondi, once strategically positioned near the city's older centers of influence, reflected this change with painful clarity. What had once been an advantage became a reminder that the center itself had moved. Decisions that once unfolded within family palaces were now made elsewhere, behind doors accessible to only a few. Notably, Florence's noble class rarely resisted this loss openly. There were no widespread revolts, no dramatic public reckonings. Instead, there was adaptation. Families invested in land rather than commerce, in strategic marriages rather than expansion, in preserving appearances rather than asserting influence. Wealth became defensive, no longer aggressive. Archival records make this transition unmistakable. Budgets once devoted to new construction shifted toward maintenance. Expansion gave way to preservation. Palazzo Gondi was no longer enlarged to announce ambition, but carefully maintained to protect memory. Stone ceased to speak of the future and became a shell for the past. Florence, true to its conservative temperament, absorbed this transformation without naming it. Festivals continued. Art remained patronized. Daily life appeared stable. Yet beneath that surface lay an irreversible truth. The old nobility was no longer the engine of the city's history. They had become custodians of tradition, not architects of direction. It was in this period that the silent decline of Florence's noble class became most fully defined. Not through sudden loss, but through power slipping away unnoticed, leaving behind palaces like Palazzo Gondi intact in form, yet increasingly distant from the currents shaping the city's future. When power withdraws from public space, it does not vanish immediately. It retreats inward, folding itself into the rooms once built to command the world beyond their walls. For Florence's noble families, palaces were never merely places to live. They were living archives, material structures designed to preserve an older social order, even after that order had ceased to function. By the 17th and 18th centuries, stepping inside palaces such as Palazzo Gondi no longer revealed the confidence of expanding authority, but the careful arrangement of a class turning inward to preserve itself. Grand halls remained intact, yet their rhythms had changed. Social gatherings no longer revolved around decisions shaping the fate of the city, but around ritual, etiquette, and the maintenance of continuity between generations. Interior spaces became sites where power transformed into memory. Portraits of ancestors occupied positions of honor, not to impress outsiders, but to remind descendants of a status that had once existed. Heraldic symbols lining the walls now functioned less as declarations and more as boundaries, separating an internal world anchored in the past from an external reality that no longer revolved around them. This silent decline was most evident in daily life. Noble households gradually contracted. Fewer servants, fewer banquets, fewer public obligations. Luxury, when it remained, became discreet and controlled. It was no longer an instrument of authority, but a means of preserving dignity. Palazzo Gondi, with its restrained layout and clearly articulated hierarchy of spaces, adapted relatively well to this transition. Large reception rooms were used less frequently, while private chambers became the center of domestic life. Power was no longer measured by how many people entered these spaces, but by the family's ability to maintain internal stability in an increasingly unpredictable world. Notably, as political influence waned, historical consciousness deepened. Florentine noble families began to see themselves as custodians rather than rulers. Documents were collected, correspondence preserved, account books retained no longer for their economic value, but for their symbolic weight. The palace evolved into an archive, a place where time itself was curated in service of lineage and memory. This shift reflected a profound change in how the nobility understood itself. No longer the drivers of history, they became its survivors. And within that transformation lay a quiet paradox. The more their real power diminished, the more firmly they clung to form, ritual, and material space as proof that decline did not equate to disappearance. Florence, during this period, became a city where past and present coexisted within the same rooms. The palaces still stood, largely unchanged, but the stories unfolding inside them had altered fundamentally. Power was no longer produced there. It was remembered, narrated, and framed within stone walls thick enough to outlast authority itself. And it was within these quiet interiors that the decline of Florence's noble class reached its most stable state, no longer painful, no longer resisted, only the slow acceptance that their role in history had shifted from those who shaped it to those who bore witness. The 19th century did not arrive in Florence as a violent rupture, but as a steady current that could not be resisted. A city long accustomed to the slow rhythms of lineage, tradition, and inherited authority now found itself drawn into a new reality, one shaped by the modern state, centralized administration, urban reform, and the rise of tourism. Within this transformation, the old nobility was not defeated. It was simply left behind. After Italian unification in 1861, Florence briefly became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. Though this period was short, its impact was profound. The city was reshaped to serve a new class of power, one no longer grounded in family history, but in bureaucracy, law, and state governance. Streets were widened, administrative districts reorganized, and spaces that had once carried deep symbolic meaning for noble families were absorbed into a fundamentally different order. In this context, palaces such as Palazzo Gondi entered an uneasy state of suspension. They remained physically present, solid, dignified, unmistakable, yet they no longer occupied a necessary role in the functioning of the city. The state did not require them to govern. The market did not depend on them to operate. And the rising middle class, though often admiring their beauty, no longer saw these spaces as gateways to the future. Decline now took on a new form: economics. Maintaining a Renaissance palace in the heart of a modernizing city became an increasingly heavy burden. Income from landholdings was no longer sufficient. Social connections that once guaranteed financial security lost their effectiveness. Some families were forced to sell portions of their property, lease rooms, or alter the function of their palaces simply to survive. As Florence reinvented itself as a city of memory and art, the role of the nobility shifted once again. They ceased to be agents of power and became elements of the urban landscape. Their palaces were photographed, described, and catalogued. Their value moved from authority to aesthetics, from instruments of rule to objects of contemplation. For families like the Gondi, this transition carried an existential weight. Their identity, once bound to their ability to influence the city, had to be redefined. They did not disappear, but their presence faded, like a familiar voice gradually drowned out in a room filled with strangers. Palazzo Gondi continued to stand, not because it was still needed, but because Florence could not erase it. The stone was too dense, the history too deeply embedded, and the collective memory too intertwined to allow destruction. Yet survival no longer meant relevance. The palace became part of the background, a fixed element within a city that had learned to speak a new language of power. It was in the 19th century that the silent decline of Florence's nobility reached a point of no return. With no path back to the center of authority, they learned to live at the margins of a history still unfolding. And palaces like Palazzo Gondi, once declarations of the future, became anchors for the past, standing still as the city around them continued to change. The 20th century opened in Florence under a weight of contradiction. The city had become a global symbol of art and memory, yet it was increasingly exposed to political, social, and military forces that no Renaissance wall of stone could resist. For the noble palaces, this was no longer an era of gradual decline, but one of survival. Families who had lived for centuries within these palazzi faced a question without precedent: could the past still sustain the present? Maintenance costs rose. Property taxes shifted. New social structures no longer favored spaces built for dynastic authority. In response, many palaces were forced to abandon their role as private residences. They were subdivided, leased, or repurposed not out of ambition, but necessity. Florence emerged from the First World War with losses that went beyond human life. The illusion of permanence was shattered. Noble families who remained began to understand that history no longer offered protection. When the Second World War arrived, this realization deepened. The city faced bombardment, occupation, and the risk of irreversible destruction. In this environment, palaces ceased to function as symbols of status and became fragile bodies exposed to the violence of modern history. What is striking is that many Florentine palaces, including Palazzo Gondi, survived the 20th century not through the power of their owners, but through the cultural value society assigned to them. They came to be understood as heritage in need of protection, no longer as purely private assets. The authority of the state, preservation institutions, and heritage law gradually replaced the authority of lineage. This transition was decisive. ownership became separated from absolute control. Families who retained possession of their palaces were required to comply with strict regulations governing conservation, restoration, and use. The palazzo was no longer a closed world. It became part of a collective responsibility to preserve urban memory. As this transformation unfolded, the identity of Florence's nobility continued to fade. They were no longer recognized by political influence or economic power, but by their association with historical buildings. Family names became attached to facades, to stone inscriptions, to small plaques read by passers-by. Their presence endured indirectly, through architecture rather than action. The 20th century also marked Florence's full entry into the global economy of tourism. The city was consumed as an image, an experience, a story. Noble palaces became stages upon which history was framed, curated, and retold for outsiders. This was a form of rebirth, but one that carried its own cost. Authority was replaced by display. Privacy gave way to public memory. Within this process, Palazzo Gondi did not disappear, nor did it remain what it once had been. It survived as a structure in transition, at once monument, adapted space, and quiet reminder that history rarely ends in collapse. More often, it continues through accommodation. And it was this accommodation that closed a long chapter in the story of Florence's nobility. No longer makers of history, they became what history chose to preserve. A humbler role, quieter in form, yet more enduring in its own way. In Florence today, no one needs to be reminded of the power once held by noble families in order to feel the weight of history. The city has learned how to live with its past as part of its present, neither worshiping it as a frozen relic, nor erasing it to make room for the new. Within this fragile balance, palaces like Palazzo Gondi continue to exist, no longer as centers of authority, but as anchors of urban memory. Modern Florence does not require palazzi to govern. It requires them to remember. Every stone facade, every narrow window, every enclosed courtyard contributes to a setting through which the city tells its own story. Palazzo Gondi no longer shapes Florence's future, but it shapes how Florence understands its past, a past marked by cycles of ascent and withdrawal that forged the city's identity. What defines the present moment is that the survival of these palaces no longer depends on the families who built them. Personal power has fully retreated, replaced by institutional authority, preservation law, and collective responsibility. The palazzo is no longer private in the historical sense. It has become part of a shared memory structure, where stewardship outweighs lineage. Seen from this perspective, the decline of Florence's nobility appears not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. They lost the ability to shape history directly, yet what they left behind continues to participate in the life of the city in a different form. Stone no longer speaks of dominance. It speaks of time. It no longer commands. It endures. Palazzo Gondi, standing quietly near Florence's former political center, embodies this shift with particular clarity. It has not been reduced to a ruin, nor fully absorbed into museum space. Instead, it occupies a middle condition, carefully protected, yet integrated into the rhythms of the city. It is precisely this state of in-betweenness that gives it meaning. History here is not frozen. It continues to breathe. As people pass by, they may see only an elegant Renaissance palace. But for Florence, these walls remember far more. They remember a moment when power was built from money and stone. They remember the gradual retreat of a class that once believed itself permanent. And above all, they remind us that no form of power lasts forever. Only memory can endure, if a society chooses to preserve it. The silent decline of Florence's nobility, then, is not a story of failure. It is a story about the limits of human authority and about architecture's capacity to outlast those limits. Palazzo Gondi no longer declares the dominance of a family. It declares the endurance of urban memory, the only force capable of surviving wealth, ambition, and time itself. And perhaps it is within this silence that Florence finds its reconciliation with history. No celebration, no mourning, only the decision to let stone remain standing, witnessing the city's ongoing transformation, just as it has done for more than 5 centuries. When the story appears to have ended, Florence continues. The city does not pause to reflect on the families that once shaped it. People keep moving through narrow streets. Evening light settles against old stone. Cafes open and close, day after day. History here never obeys narrative logic. It does not conclude. It simply changes roles. Palazzo Gondi exists within that condition. No longer a center of power, no longer a symbol of dynastic ambition. It has become part of the city's quiet circulation. It does not demand attention. It does not raise its voice. Its presence is subdued enough to merge into the urban fabric, yet enduring enough to resist disappearance. This reflects how Florence has learned to live with its past, not by turning it into myth, and not by cutting ties with it. Noble families like the Gondi are not erased from memory, but neither do they occupy a central place in the city's modern identity. They remain as a historical sediment, lying beneath the surface of daily life, visible only to those willing to slow down and look more closely. The silent decline of Florence's nobility thus carries a meaning far beyond their own story. It reveals how power, when it loses its ability to adapt, does not always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it withdraws quietly, dissolving into routine, leaving behind physical traces that future generations must learn to interpret rather than command. In this sense, Palazzo Gondi resembles a surviving paragraph in a long and layered book. It no longer determines the direction of the narrative, but it allows the reader to understand the chapters that came before. Without it, Florence would lose depth. With it, the city does not return to the past. Both conditions exist at once, without contradiction. As night falls, the stone walls offer no explanation, yet it is precisely this silence that grants them value. They do not ask to be remembered, but they remain, available to memory for anyone willing to listen. Florence has chosen to let its history exist in this way. Not imposed, not sentimentalized, simply present. And perhaps this is the most honest ending to the story of Palazzo Gondi and the quiet decline of Florence's nobility. Not a definitive conclusion, but a continuation. The city keeps changing. People arrive and depart. And the stone walls, built to challenge time itself, remain not to prove lost power, but to remind us that all power, sooner or later, becomes memory. Morning in Florence always arrives quietly. Before crowds gather, before the city resumes its role as a global destination, there is a brief interval when the streets belong only to themselves. Early light touches stone without urgency, without display. In that moment, the old palaces are at their clearest, unmasked by noise, movement, or expectation. Palazzo Gondi enters the day in the same way. No ceremony, no servants, no powerful family stepping onto a balcony. Only a structure of stone, standing as it has for centuries, accepting its new role within a city that has fundamentally changed. In contemporary Florence, power no longer leaves visible marks. It moves quickly, invisibly, rarely tied to place. Yet Renaissance palaces remain as interruptions in time, forcing the city to slow down, reminding it of an era when authority required walls, thickness, position, and order to sustain itself. Seen from the present, the silent decline of Florence's nobility no longer resembles loss. It appears instead as an orderly retreat, a transfer of the stage that leaves no ruins behind. What remains is not emptiness, but a layer of memory dense enough to support the city's continuing identity. In this sense, Palazzo Gondi is not an ending. It is a threshold between what has passed and what continues. It demonstrates that history does not need constant authority to survive. Sometimes, endurance alone is enough to prevent a story from breaking. Florence has chosen to let stories like this exist within everyday life, without heavy annotation or excessive reverence. The stone walls do their work quietly. They hold memory without imposing it. They allow each generation to decide how much to remember, how deeply to understand. And perhaps this is the truest legacy left by Florence's nobility. Not power, not wealth, but spaces strong enough to allow later generations to reflect on their own limits. In the stillness of early morning, before the city fully awakens, Palazzo Gondi stands as a wordless reminder that every order has its time, but memory, once placed in space and protected by collective choice, can outlast ambition itself. The history of Florence, like all written history, tends to remember grand moments, dynasties rising, reforms enacted, names that echo far beyond the city's walls. But alongside that visible narrative exists another layer of memory, quieter and less defined, a history not marked by dates or decrees, but by withdrawal, by roles slowly fading without sufficient drama to be named. Palazzo Gondi belongs to this quieter memory. There is no single year that marks the end of the Gondi family's power, no event dramatic enough to serve as a historical boundary. Instead, there is a sequence of small adjustments, defensive choices, cautious decisions, compromises made with one aim in mind: to remain present for one more generation. In Florence's archives, this process appears not in political proclamations, but in details that seem almost mundane. Lease agreements replace credit contracts. Maintenance records take the place of expansion plans. Family letters speak of expenses and obligations rather than ambition. It is within these fragments that the silent decline of Florence's nobility becomes most legible. What is striking is that this withdrawal does not signify personal failure. It reflects a broader transformation. The world had changed in ways that rendered older forms of power ineffective. The Gondi family, like many others, was not defeated by a rival, but by time and by new social structures that no longer rewarded inherited authority. Across centuries, Palazzo Gondi became a vessel for what went unspoken. Every renovation was a negotiation. Every preserved detail was a conscious choice, made with the understanding that removal would erase part of memory itself. These decisions rarely appear in major histories, yet they are precisely what shaped Florence's passage into modernity. Florence is unusual in that it did not construct its modern identity by severing ties with its noble past. Instead, it allowed those traces to remain as secondary narratives, not dominant, not directive, but persistent. This approach drained the decline of its bitterness. The nobility did not fall catastrophically. They stepped aside. Palazzo Gondi thus stands as a particular kind of witness. Not to dramatic events, but to long processes in which power slowly lost practical meaning while retaining symbolic weight. It demonstrates that history is shaped not only by action, but by restraint, by the decision to preserve rather than replace, to endure rather than assert. And it is precisely these unrecorded choices that form the most elusive layer of Florence's story. Not loud, not spectacular, but durable. A city learning how to move forward without erasing the footprints it no longer follows, allowing them to fade naturally rather than be violently removed or deliberately forgotten. As Florence opened itself to the modern world, it did not choose to tell its history through grand declarations. There is no official narrative staged for visitors explaining the decline of the noble class. Instead, the city allows that story to exist indirectly through space, through rhythm, and through a deliberate use of silence. Visitors often arrive in Florence searching for brilliant Renaissance art, legendary names, monuments celebrated as pinnacles of European civilization. Yet alongside that radiance lies another experience, more subtle. It is the sense that this city once held many centers of power, and that each of them, in turn, receded into the background without a clear moment of ending. Palazzo Gondi appears within this story not as a destination, but as a detail. It is not a central stop on guided routes, nor framed as a singular monument. And precisely because of this, it feels honest. Palazzo Gondi exists exactly as the decline of Florence's nobility unfolded present, but not dominant. Florence tells its past by allowing it to dissolve into everyday life. Palaces are not isolated from the city, but embedded within streets where people live, work, and pass through daily. History is not staged. It is layered. Visitors are not instructed to mourn or admire lost power. They are invited simply to observe. This choice has shaped Florence's global appeal. In an era when many cities package history for rapid consumption, Florence maintains distance. Palaces like Palazzo Gondi are not over-explained. They are permitted to remain quiet, and in that quiet, curiosity deepens. Meaning is discovered rather than delivered. The silent decline of Florence's nobility is therefore not frozen in museums or textbooks. It is dispersed across the city itself in stone, in scale, in absence. Florence does not recount this story to teach a lesson, but to live alongside it. And through this manner of telling, the city achieves something rare. It transforms loss into depth. There is no climax, no moral verdict. Only the recognition that Florence's beauty lies not only in what endured, but in what knew when to withdraw. If there is a way to close a long story about the quiet decline of Florence's nobility, it is not through a major event, but through a very small moment. A moment not recorded in chronicles, not tied to a date or a name, yet one that holds the meaning of centuries. Inside Palazzo Gondi, light always enters slowly. It passes through narrow windows, touches stone, and then lingers. There is no spectacle, no deliberate display, only light meeting material, as it has done for hundreds of years, regardless of who holds power beyond these walls. Within such spaces, the difference between power and existence becomes unmistakable. Power requires use to retain meaning. When it is no longer exercised, it dissolves. Existence is different. It does not need to prove itself. It only needs to continue. Palazzo Gondi has passed through that transformation. From a space built to assert position, it has become a space that holds time itself without contest, without resistance. Imagine a late afternoon. No visitors. No event. Only the faint sound of the city reaching inward from afar. In that moment, the palace belongs neither to a family nor fully to the public. It exists for itself, as a structure that has learned how to live after its original purpose has ended. Here, the deepest meaning of the silent decline emerges. Florence's nobility did not vanish in catastrophe. They dissolved into the city's structure, leaving behind spaces that later generations must learn to read on their own. There are no instructions, no authority left to dictate interpretation. Only stone, light, and a silence long enough to reveal that history does not always require drama. Through palaces like Palazzo Gondi, Florence demonstrates a rare capacity of historic cities, the ability to let power withdraw without destroying what it once created. The city did not trap the nobility in form, nor did it erase them to modernize itself. It allowed the transition to unfold naturally, slowly, almost unnoticed at the time. Looking back from the present, it is precisely this lack of spectacle that becomes most thought-provoking. Not every ending needs to be marked. Some endings are simply changes of function, of meaning, of how people relate to the spaces around them. In this small moment, Palazzo Gondi tells no story of greatness. It tells a story of limits, of how power, even when built in thick stone, is only temporary, and of how memory, when placed in space and collectively protected, can endure far longer than ambition. That may be the final image worth holding on to. Not a magnificent palace, not a powerful family, but a quiet space where history has completed its role and gently yielded to the present. When the final words fall away, Florence does not close its story. The city remains, moving forward at its own pace, as it has for centuries. Cars pass through narrow streets. Light reflects off old stone. Doors open and close. There is no declared ending, because Florence has never understood history that way. Palazzo Gondi stands within this ongoing movement. It does not ask to be explained or emphasized. Its presence alone is enough to suggest that there was once a time when power required thick walls and precise placement to assert itself. And yet that same presence reveals something else, that when power withdraws, it does not always leave ruins behind. Sometimes it leaves order, memory, and spaces that allow later generations to reflect. The quiet decline of Florence's nobility is not a lament for a lost age. It is a lesson in limits. No structure of authority can remain forever in its original form. What matters is not permanence, but the capacity of a city to absorb change without losing itself. Florence did not choose to erase its past in order to advance, nor did it freeze that past into something untouchable. Instead, it chose to live alongside it. Palaces became part of daily life. Former centers of power dissolved into the urban landscape, visible enough to be recognized, yet restrained enough not to dominate. Through this choice, decline became depth. What once ruled became background. What once commanded became memory. And from this transformation emerged Florence's most enduring strength, not the spectacle of triumph, but the maturity of a city that knows how to let history step aside without being denied. As the image fades to black, there is no final monument, no definitive closing shot. Only the sense that this story continues beyond the frame, carried in the footsteps of those who pass by stone walls every day. Palazzo Gondi, and palaces like it, do not demand remembrance. They remain so that if someone slows down long enough, history will speak on its own terms, not through power, but through time. After power withdraws, what remains is not emptiness, but landscape. In Florence, memory is not confined to sealed museums, nor is it forced to speak. It exists in the proportions of streets, in the thickness of stone walls, in the way light touches surfaces worn down by time. Palazzo Gondi exists precisely in this state. No longer a center of influence, no longer a generator of authority, the palace has become part of the city's foundation, a structure Florence leans on to maintain balance between past and present. One does not need to know the name Gondi to feel the historical weight the building carries. Florence has learned to let memory dissolve into space, rather than confining it to a single narrative. Noble palaces no longer demand explanation, because their presence is explanation enough. They testify to a time when power required physical form, stone, architecture, permanence. And they also testify that this time has passed. Seen from here, the quiet decline of the nobility is no longer a family story. It becomes an urban condition. A city learning how to carry its past without allowing that past to dictate its future. The stone walls do not block what comes next. They simply provide context, a way for the future to understand where it is coming from. In this sense, Palazzo Gondi does not belong to history as a closed chapter, but as a layer. It does not retell old stories, yet it deepens every new one that unfolds in Florence. Not through nostalgia, but through continuity. And it is this continuity that reveals a deeper truth. Memory, when placed correctly, does not slow a city down. It makes it steadier. When the camera finally pulls away from the stone walls, what remains is not an image, but a feeling. The sense that this story does not belong only to Palazzo Gondi, nor solely to the nobility of Florence. It belongs to every structure of power that once believed itself permanent. Florence does not conclude its history with judgment. It neither glorifies the nobility it lost nor condemns it. The city allows time to do its work. Power withdraws. Memory settles. And what truly matters is preserved without force. Palazzo Gondi, in the end, is no longer a symbol of wealth or decline. It is evidence of something simpler and more enduring, that architecture can outlive ambition, and that space can retain meaning even after its original purpose has vanished. Today, few people stop in front of palaces like this. And that, perhaps, is the clearest sign of Florence's maturity. History does not need to be stared at to survive. It only needs permission to remain. And this may be the most honest ending to this long story. Not a declaration, not a dramatic image, but the acknowledgement that all power eventually departs, while what is built slowly, deeply, and truthfully endures, not to dominate, but to remind. Florence continues. Streets continue to carry people forward, and the stone walls, no longer bearing names, still stand quietly holding the part of history. The city has chosen not to forget, long after the stories have been told, and long after the names have faded from collective memory. The silence remains. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of persistence, a silence that only subsides when conflict has passed and there is nothing left to prove. In Florence, this silence is not empty. It is full of continuity. It is present in the spaces between buildings, in the way the stone absorbs sound, in the patience of architectural works not made to speak quickly. Palaces like Palazzo Gondi no longer proclaim their presence. They wait. This waiting is not passive. It is a form of presence that does not need confirmation. The city has learned to move without disturbing it. Everyday life flows within these walls without friction, without ritual. It is a silent agreement between the past and the present. What endures here is not power, not wealth, not even memory in narrative form. What endures is restraint. The decision not to rewrite what came before. The willingness to leave history unfinished, unresolved, and therefore humane. Florence does not demand admiration for its past. The city only asks that it not be erased. And in doing so, it reveals something rare, that the most enduring forms of power are often those that voluntarily retreat, leaving space rather than domination. Time passes, the stone walls do not change. They remain, not as obstacles, not as monuments, but as witnesses quiet enough to be overlooked, strong enough to endure. And perhaps this is the ultimate truth that the ancient palaces of Florence carry with them, that life lies not in control, but in acceptance. Not in being loudly reprimanded, but in being allowed to exist. When everything else has passed, the silence does not disappear. It remains. At a certain point, history no longer needs to be expanded. There is a moment when adding more words no longer deepens the meaning, but risks distorting it. Florence has reached that point many times before, and has learned when to stop speaking. What remains now is not a conclusion, but a state. A city no longer needs to explain itself. The streets no longer seek explanation. The buildings have stood long enough to need no justification. The ancient palaces stand firm in this state without expectation. They need no relevance. They do not compete with the present. Their longevity is not a statement, but a consequence of being built slowly, inhabited carefully, and abandoned without violence. In this way, Florence demonstrates a rare historical maturity. It doesn't rush to summarize itself. It allows meaning to accumulate quietly, unevenly, sometimes imperfectly. The past isn't resolved here. It's reconciled. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson these walls offer, that history doesn't need to end to be complete. Power doesn't need to triumph to leave a legacy. Silence, when chosen rather than imposed, can be the most sincere form of continuation. Nothing more needs to be added. The city goes on, and the stones remain.